Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist here at American Compass. And while I always tell you this is a very special episode, this very special episode is especially special because we are joined by FTC Chair Lina Khan for a really interesting conversation that is much more wide-ranging than just the FTC specifically or antitrust, talking a lot about the structure of the economy more broadly, what we need it to deliver, how competition or its lack thereof affects consumers, small businesses, the political culture, and then a whole range of different policy questions, both within antitrust enforcement and more broadly for the kinds of reforms that she has been interested in and pursued and that we could see pursued in a Trump administration as well. So very grateful to her for making the time to join us and think you'll really enjoy that conversation. Before we get to it, of course, have to tell you about the many, many things going on at American Compass. A really good piece on the Commons this week from Chad Scudieri on what Chevron's demise means for Trump and his administration. And hopefully you saw our announcement that the Commons is going bigger. In the new year, we will be launching a full-on magazine. It is called Commonplace. It is about what matters in America. And much more to come, but you can subscribe now at commonplace.org. And please follow us as well on X. The handle there is CommonPLC. So obviously you will be hearing more about that than you want from me in the weeks and months to come, but very excited to be stepping up the quality, consistency, volume of what we are publishing as we really try to become a home for all of the ongoing debates about the future of conservatism. Finally, must mention, of course, Understanding America, my own Substack. You can subscribe at understandingamerica.co. Talked about the meaning of productivity on Monday and going to be diving in Friday to a wonderful piece just put out by Senator-elect Jim Banks on his thoughts for focusing on a working class conservatism that I think did an especially good job of delineating and prioritizing what that sort of agenda needs to look like. So check out all of that. And without further ado, here is Chair Khan. And we are joined now by FTC Chair Lina Khan. Chair Khan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I was trying to think of what should we talk about and ended up with a much too long list. So we'll see what we manage to get to. But really wanted to start with some bigger picture discussion about sort of some of the economic challenges in the country, because I think a lot of focus on competition and ultimately becomes a discussion about, antitrust enforcement court filings. But I think there's a much bigger picture conversation that's just one small part of. So would love to start by just asking you, how do you think about the key broad challenges we face and how competition fits into them?
Yeah, happy to. And I think it's helpful just to step back and try to think about how does antitrust and competition fit within the set of economic policy tools that we have, right? I mean, this idea around anti-monopoly goes back to the founding, where there was actually a debate about whether we should even have, as part of our Constitution, a specific anti-monopoly clause. And, that really stemmed from the recognition that in order to have real liberty, you need to have checks and balances, not just in our political sphere and sphere of governance, but also when it comes to private power. That real coercion and undermining of people's liberties could come from the state, but it could also come from unchecked private power. And so that philosophical orientation of antitrust is really being, at the end of the day, about freedom and liberty, is really my North Star in a lot of this work. Of course, there are also enormous economic benefits to competition, and I think a deep commitment to competition and antitrust has helped make America's economy the envy of the world. I think it's really contributed to the breakthrough innovations that we have housed. And so what has really helped catalyze a move to make sure we are fully reinvigorating our commitment to antitrust, I think, is the growing set of empirical evidence that have shown that markets across the U.S. economy have actually become less competitive and more consolidated over the last few decades. And that has correlated with, higher prices, lower wages, in some instances, lower rates of new business formation, lower rates of, breakthrough innovations. And so there's, a greater move now to want to make sure we're being fully faithful to the law, but also following commercial realities and not just relying on certain models or theories about how the economy works and actually going back to first principles.
What do you think is the sort of most compelling empirical evidence, especially in a way that the typical person would notice? Because I know there's no shortage of, NBER papers with every possible way of measuring concentration that says it's gotten worse, it's gotten better, it's only in these industries, it depends. What do you look at that you think most clearly makes the case that something really is different now than it might have been in the past?
I think one of the most striking dimensions of the concentration problem has been just how fragile it has made our markets. And people have experienced this over the last few years, right? We've seen how a single storm can suddenly trigger shortages of products ranging from IV bags to infant formula, right? Where we had a single contamination in a single factory that led to shortages across the United States. We've seen senior military members and folks in the Defense Department talk about how concentration has also led to undermining of national security, where there was a single natural disaster that meant that the single factory where we had concentrated production of a particular kind of gunpowder suddenly went offline. So I think you see directly how concentration can make our markets much more fragile. This is especially true in the technology context, where we've seen how a single technological glitch can ground tens of thousands of flights, upending travel for millions of people. So I think you're right that there are a lot of entryways into the extreme concentration problem. I do think, and this was especially true during the pandemic, the kind of supply chain fragility and risk component is one that we definitely we don't want to be caught by surprise there. And when we are, it can be a pretty rude awakening.
Yeah, the resilience point is a really interesting one, and I think it adds another dimension to the point you'd started with about sort of private power, because it's a really, in some senses, different problem whether you have extremely powerful or not so powerful corporations. The question of what sort of resilience we have is something we clearly need to do a lot better on. I think on the power side, I remember I was struck by a speech I think you gave back in May at the American Economic Liberties Project, where you talked about fear as a dimension of this, and the way that when you thought about the freedom and liberty as key concerns here, it was this idea that, in a sense, people shouldn't be subject to or afraid of what other private entities can do. Where do you see that happening most? Where do you think people are, not just frustrated, but actively fearful? Where does that come from?
Well, the area where I hear those concerns most is often from small businesses, candidly, who find that their livelihood and their ability to keep their business afloat is now suddenly dependent on some big business that oftentimes is some type of gatekeeper or middleman that they are entirely dependent on. And they see how overnight the terms of service can change or the algorithm can change. So they went from being on the first page of search results to now being on the 7th page. That's devastating for their business. They're not quite sure why it happened. And they don't have any recourse, right? And even when we do our investigations as law enforcers and try to reach out to businesses to tell us what they're experiencing, they will say, look, I have a lot of problems and challenges with this firm, but I'm terrified that if I share that information with you, I will face retaliation and my business will go under. My entryway into a lot of this work was actually as a business researcher and journalist, and I spent some time understanding how chicken farming outworks in America, where you have, millions of consumers, thousands of farmers, and a relatively small number of intermediaries, these chicken processors that now connect the farmers to the consumers. And because we've seen so much consolidation, we have more or less four big chicken processors that farmers are dependent on. Regionally, oftentimes these farmers just have one processor. And while doing that work, it was really quite eye-opening to see what type of arbitrary contractual terms these chicken processors could end up imposing on the farmers. And the farmers really lived in fear of retaliation, of waking up one day and having been given the sick chicks instead of the healthy ones. And again, them not having any real recourse. And so I think you see this most sometimes in the context of small businesses, individual proprietors, people whose livelihoods are dependent on a single firm. And this can also be true in some of the, more contemporary digital markets. I mean, we sometimes hear this from entrepreneurs, from founders, people whose app is doing great, and then one day they wake up to find out they've, in theory, violated some app store policy and have been kicked off, and their entire revenue source has disappeared. Right. And there's, enormous frustration, but also a recognition that the enormity of the dependence they have on a single firm means that there are real strings attached to what they can say or do.
Yeah, this is a great example. That even sort of corrects a premise in my question that sort of used the standard kind of consumer welfare lens, that if there's a problem, we must be worried about what's happening to consumers somewhere. In this case, it is a lot of times more often the relationship between different types of businesses, and where and to the chicken example, it's really interesting. It's not necessarily the supplier that has all the power. It can be the supplier or the customer somewhere in the supply chain. What it brings to mind is, of course, where antitrust got its start with the railroads and the agricultural providers or producers sort of dependent on a single mode of transport. What's striking about a lot of these contemporary examples, though, is that they aren't natural monopolies. I mean, there's a reason why you were only going to have one railway running to your farm. It's a lot less obvious why you would only have one chicken processing plant. And so I'm curious what you see as the key drivers of this sort of concentration. Maybe lack of antitrust enforcement is a piece of it, but it seems like there must be a lot more than that going on, which, to your point at the beginning, speaks then to a much broader range of policy tools to be talking about than just antitrust.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and an important one as we try to dissect kind of how do we get here and what are all the different policy levers that we need to activate if we want to steer our way out. One thing that we hear, especially from entrepreneurs and small businesses, is the way that the lending landscape has also changed, and how, as you've seen, especially banks consolidate, that has meant that the lending streams for smaller businesses have become less available. And you can imagine how, previously you had more community banks that knew people in their community. There was a baseline relationship of trust and were more comfortable making some of those loans. We've also heard, and this is especially true in the tech context, that the challenges with going public have meant that acquisitions and getting acquired ends up being a pretty attractive exit route, and that if we actually had more avenues for either going public, or that they didn't feel like the choice was effectively get bought out by one of the handful of dominant tech companies or likely go under, that would create more room for them to be able to survive independently. So I think you're right that there are a range of factors happening here, and we need to kind of interrogate all of them.
Yeah, tech keeps coming up. It's it is in none of these situations the entire story, but it seems like in every case it is part of the story. And I guess there are some folks who see, we'll call it big tech, even though of course the biggest tech companies are entirely different in their business models in a lot of ways. Big tech may just be the next wave of major commercial power in this country, or it could be different in kind, not just degree. How do you think about that? Is this a novel challenge or the same thing yet again?
I think there are dimensions of both. I think there are real resonances with some of the challenges we face with prior kind of infrastructure networks that had some of these properties of, high fixed costs, significant economies of scale, network externalities that can kind of tend and lead some of these markets to tip. I do think that the digital overlay here and the role of data really does in some ways change the nature of what we're dealing with, both in terms of the way that data itself can be a driver of some of this consolidation, such that once you do have a player that's become a leader in a market, the data advantages that they have can just become formidable when you're thinking about what does it look like for an upstart to potentially try to catch up. I think the data dimension also changes some of the ways that these firms, that these kind of network firms or infrastructure firms or platforms or whatever you want to call them, that the ways that they can deploy their power, deploy their platform power. And we've seen this especially when you've seen vertical integration by platforms. So they're both hosting certain commercial activity, but also then competing with the businesses that are dependent on them. And we've heard concerns about, I'm dependent on this network, but are they spying on me and then using my proprietary commercially sensitive data to then further, compete with me? And so some of those concerns are quite interesting. I think this is also an area where we see, again, some of the porousness between concerns about state power and concerns about private power, right? We've seen this in the surveillance context where we have Fourth Amendment protections against certain forms of government spying. And there's a real question about what it looks like to make sure those protections are still vindicated and real in a world where you have private companies that are collecting so much granular information about us. So I think those are just some of the fresh challenges that we face now.
Yeah, and in the privacy realm in particular, it seems to me it's interesting. Again, we have both almost a business privacy question and then separately a consumer privacy question, although potentially they could be addressed along the same lines. Where do you see that debate headed? I feel like we've been having the privacy debate for a very long time. It seems to me it doesn't really get anywhere. Frankly, for the most part, it seems to me it doesn't get anywhere because at the end of the day, I'm not sure how much most people care. Like in the abstract, they will say they care. It doesn't seem certainly that they're willing to deal with any of the inconveniences that might come along with greater privacy. But this is sort of a different way into the issue, privacy and control of data mattering almost from the perspective of industrial organization, of government power, and so forth.
You're right that there is this threshold question about, well, how do we know that people even care since everybody seems to be using these services that are spying on them and everybody's still using them? I do think that there's kind of a first order question about whether these are actually revealed preferences or whether people actually feel like they even have choice, or whether they're fully informed about what data is really being collected about them in the first instance. And I think that question around do people actually have choice here is an important one. As some of these technologies have become increasingly essential for navigating day-to-day life, you can imagine a parent saying, okay, I care about my kid's privacy, but is my trying to protect that kid's privacy going to mean that they can't do their homework tonight, right? I mean, like, what are the choices that we're actually putting before people, and are the ways that people are making choices in that moment really revealing of what their optimal preference would be for what they would see in the market? I think the other issue here is privacy can kind of sound abstract, right? And I think this is where the FTC's work has been really important in surfacing what are some of the harms of so much data, sensitive data being collected about people, and how is that data being used? I will say as a first instance, we've been able to actually get courts to now acknowledge that privacy invasions themselves can constitute injury under the law. You don't actually need to say, well, yes, your privacy was injured, and then that data was used to stalk you or harm you in some other way. That there is a recognition now. We got this great decision in district court in Idaho that privacy invasions themselves can be injury. That said, we also have a lot of evidence through the cases we've brought that this data can be used in some pretty awful ways. Some of this surveillance is basically facilitating spying and stalkerware. We've also seen, people's sensitive data relating to geolocation, relating to their health, relating to their browsing data be made available for sale quite easily in ways that have also led to further misuse. And so I think you need to kind of also explain to people how this data is being used. We currently have right now one of our market studies underway that's trying to understand, are firms also using this very targeted set of data they have to set targeted prices, right? And this gets to this concept of first degree price discrimination, the idea that every single consumer could be charged a consumer specific price based on what the firm knows about their willingness to pay. For a long time, this idea of first degree price discrimination was somewhat of a thought experiment. You could see companies kind of crudely try to approximate what your willingness to pay might be, but the technological environment we're living in has just totally changed the game in terms of the types of individual characteristics that a firm could now know about you, and the fact that a lot of commerce is being done on kind of individualized screens such that people could also be shown different prices without necessarily realizing. So we are doing this market inquiry right now to understand, it seems like firms have the ability to do this, the incentive to do this, and there might not be laws that necessarily prohibit all of it. And so let's understand to what extent is this happening. Because I do think if people have recognized that the data that's being collected about them could be exploited against them by manipulating the prices that you're paying versus what your neighbor is paying for the exact same good or service, that could also be quite revelatory.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to get into on a bunch of these questions of sort of what do you do about it. But first, I have to ask one more question on sort of the big picture, because I think I am certainly very sympathetic to the view that we have a problem of excessive concentration, corporate power, and so forth. I think Matt Stoller's work, his book Goliath, is terrific on this. We proudly publish him at American Compass. I also think Mike Lind has fascinating and important thoughts on this stuff. His book is Big is Beautiful, and we love publishing him. And he makes the case that, there are a lot of ways in which very large, powerful corporations create benefits, whether that is as a matter of sort of being a national champion, being able to bring the kind of investment to bear that's necessary for, both economies of scale and innovation. And then even in measures like, who tends to perform best as an employer. And so I'm curious, to what extent are you sympathetic to the big is beautiful view, or else what do you think is wrong with it?
Yeah, I mean, in this role as FTC chair, it's not my job to kind of say, well, I subscribe to a big is beautiful philosophy, and therefore I'm not going to enforce the antitrust laws, right? We've, as an agency, have been given certain laws to enforce, and we have to follow through on that. And certainly if Congress wants to make certain determinations that in particular sectors they do want to have national champions or do want to kind of protect monopolies rather than encourage competition, that is absolutely a policy judgment that is their prerogative to make, and enforcers have to honor that. I do think what we've seen in practice is some of the real downsides of these national champion type models. Again, especially when it concerns national security, but when you're taking into account some of the resiliency trade-offs, I think that is non-trivial. And again, something for policymakers to take into account. But of course, always interested in seeing the kind of the evidence and the data and figure out what makes most sense.
Yeah, and I think where that becomes relevant, and I wanted to start there before getting into the sort of what to do, is certainly to your point, if you're asking about or if I'm asking, I guess, about what are the appropriate FTC enforcement actions, let's say, it doesn't matter whether big is beautiful or not. The question is, what is FTC law on or what is law that the FTC is implementing and enforcing on the question. At the same time, in sort of the bigger discussion of the full set of policy tools we should want to bring to bear in hopefully shaping as productive an economy as possible, I think we hit these questions quite unavoidably. Thinking about an area like industrial policy, or even if we're funding research and development, let's say, there is a big trade-off between saying, actually, it would be great if we had some very large tech companies running very large labs, and we want to lean into funding that, versus actually we think that's quite counterproductive. We would, we also have the BIR program, and we really think kind of funding startups and in fact preventing them from all getting bought up by the big company is what counts. So we'll jump to some of the FTC stuff, but I guess more broadly, thinking about some of the other policy tools available, what is at the top of your list in terms of the kinds of economic policies you think that would contribute to better shaping the pattern of economic activity in the country?
It's an important question, and there are different policy levers outside of the purview of the FTC, though, sometimes the FTC's work ends up being complementary. So just to give you a concrete example, there's being a real push across administrations on a bipartisan basis to be really encouraging manufacturing in America. And as we've seen Made in America take off, we've also seen bad actors try to exploit the Made in USA label. And so part of what the FTC does, for example, is to make sure that firms are not able to lie about their products being made in the USA, because if there is actually going to be a market advantage to that, you want to make sure people are not being deceived and that honest businesses are not losing out to dishonest businesses in that dimension. I think more big picture, there is this historic question around what is better for innovation in America. Is it monopolies that better deliver innovation, or is it in fact competitive markets? And this is kind of the shorthand is sometimes the Schumpeter-Arrow debate on this. And as I read the empirical work, a lot of it ends up coming down to the question of what type of innovation do you want to promote? Because monopolists and dominant firms can be quite good at continuing to deliver some of the incremental advances in their existing product streams. But historically, the breakthrough paradigm shifting innovations have come from the outsiders and the disruptors. And so I take that to mean you really do want markets where disruptive ideas can win and have a shot at succeeding, even if they're making the incumbents uncomfortable or less profitable, right? And so I think having those markets be designed in a way that is open to new ideas, fresh ideas, rather than the success of an upstart being entirely dependent on whether the incumbent wants this idea to thrive, I think is a really important balance to get right. Because again, I think what has contributed to America's success technologically is welcoming that disruption and having markets that are able to allow those outsiders to come in and succeed if they have a great idea and the talent to execute on it.
And you were describing earlier the phenomenon we have now where, certainly we have very robust venture capital markets in at least some areas. But by and large, the goal and the path to success is to start doing something and then get bought out very quickly by a small set of trillion-dollar companies. To the extent that we think that's not especially healthy for the economy at large, even if it's very good for the venture capitalists involved, how do you tackle that? Obviously there's some ability to just outright prohibit mergers and acquisitions, but when you're at the level of scooping up the nascent startup, it becomes certainly harder to build the kind of federal anti-competitive case against it. And there's sort of a broader set of incentives or almost a cultural ecosystem as much as an economic one that has to be affected. How would you go after that?
So I think this is where we need to make sure that anti-competitive activity is not what is preventing some of the startups from being able to scale and thrive, such that they narrow their options to, which monopolist am I going to sell out to? And so that does require enforcers to be active and make sure you're not seeing certain types of predation in the market by the big guys, or certain types of tying or bundling or other types of practices that are actually closing off those avenues for independents to thrive and scale. I think within the question of kind of M&A, first of all, if you had more potential buyers, that would give the founders more leverage, right? An ecosystem in which you have 6 or 7 or 8 potential buyers is better for that startup than an ecosystem where you just have 1 or 2 in terms of your ability to even negotiate better deal terms. I also think that, you want markets where people are able to think independently and bring the ideas that they think are best and have a great shot of succeeding, separate from the question of, is this idea going to be one that the existing incumbent is going to recognize and buy up, right? I mean, and this goes back to kind of more Hayekian principles of like the virtues of decentralized market and wanting to have, just more nodes that are able to provide that creativity and be able to introduce more products and more business ideas into the market, rather than having that kind of centralized decision making. And look, our economy is different from those of places like China, right? And having a more competitive economy rather than a more centralized one is one that's really served us well. I think we just need to be aware that that centralization can, in effect, happen not just through the government, but also centralization through monopolization. If at the end of the day, you're still losing some of the virtues of the more decentralized systems that allow those great, innovative, outsider, disruptor ideas to kind of make it in.
Yeah. And what does that mean for something like the privacy issue we were talking about previously? I think, in some ways, maybe competition helps because consumers have more choice. In practice, certainly my sense is the way in which the decisions are made about the use of data are so opaque that even if I had a wide range of service providers, probably I would be subject to roughly the same terms and conditions from all of them. I guess someone could launch an entire business whose premise was, we protect your data company, and then you'd see if they have to charge a higher price for it, whether people would be willing to pay a higher price for it. Is that sort of issue one that you think competition is likely to address, or does that become the sort of place where there needs to be more of a regulatory solution defining the rules of the road where the market just is not going to create the right set of incentives?
Yeah, I think you're probably right that it's going to be the latter, right? I mean, competition occurs against a backdrop of what means of competition are really fair game versus not fair, right? And the FTC has a role there, right? Our statutory provision says there's a prohibition against unfair methods of competition, and so we have a role. But you're right that for certain kind of more bread and butter prohibitions, if we don't want companies to compete by taking shortcuts on food safety, the way we fix that is by having, rules of the road for what kind of food is safe versus not safe. Similarly, if you don't want companies to compete over who can least pay their workers, you want to have, federal law that is setting certain floors and that sort of thing. So I imagine that you're right. And in the long term, we really do need some type of comprehensive privacy scheme from Congress to create those baseline rules.
Yeah, and you mentioned workers. I'm glad. I wanted to make sure we spent at least a minute on workers, because even when we get away from consumers, it then becomes the suppliers and the customers. The worker side of it, I think, is super interesting. Partly as sort of a monopsony question: do workers suffer from only having a limited range of potential employers? But even more broadly, I think it's interesting because there's increased focus on and interest in the idea of collective worker power in a sense of saying, well, if you're going to have so much concentrated corporate power on one side, we at least need to make sure that workers have a greater capacity to in a sense, mount countervailing power, which describes what the U.S. economy looked like in the middle of the 20th century. You had a lot of large industrial oligopolies, and you had very large and powerful unions. Do you think about the sort of labor organizing side of the question at all in the competition space? Do you think it affects how the issues more directly before the FTC have to be evaluated?
So this was an issue right from the get-go in antitrust enforcement, where in the decades following the passage of the Sherman Act, enforcers actually used these laws to go after workers who were looking to organize. And ultimately, in 1914, when Congress passed the Clayton Act, it included a provision, Section 6, that basically creates an exemption for workers who are looking to organize for the purpose of, improving their workplace conditions. And so Congress has affirmatively said, these laws banning collusion and cartels are not designed to be thwarting workers that are organizing for the purposes of, vindicating rights that would later come into play under the National Labor Relations Act. And so that is kind of a core feature of the antitrust regime. We have seen at various points over the last couple of decades the law again being used against workers, specifically independent contractors who were looking to organize, say, with certain types of rideshare companies. So I've made clear during my tenure that I don't believe that's the kind of proper purpose of the antitrust laws. And so from a prosecutorial discretion perspective, we've been focused on making sure we're going after dominant firms that are abusing their monopoly power and engaging in illegal tactics rather than independent contractors or workers that are supposed to be protected under these laws from that type of weaponization. I think more generally, we have seen empirical work showing that labor markets are actually more concentrated than economists previously assumed. And as that concentration increases, you actually do see concurrent decline in wages, reduction in certain types of benefits for workers. And so that has put this question of labor competition and monopsony more on the map. Since I joined the commission, I've made it a priority to make sure, as we're reviewing mergers and acquisitions, for example, we're of course looking at how consumers would be impacted, but we're also understanding, could there be impacts on labor markets here? Could this deal substantially reduce competition in the market for labor such that it would be unlawful in the same way that if consumers were harmed in that way, it would be too? And so that's, a muscle that we've really built, and I'm really proud of our team for having been able to kind of incorporate that skill set. We've also been looking at other restrictive contractual provisions in employment contracts, such as non-compete clauses, which we promulgated a rule prohibiting, as well as having brought some enforcement actions. Just last week, we brought an enforcement action relating to these no-hire provisions, where this company basically prevented rivals from hiring its employees even after they had left. So we've been focused just how do we make sure the antitrust tools are serving everybody. That, of course, means America's consumers, but it also means America's workers that deserve the protections of competition, too.
Sure. Well, that's a perfect segue to the last question, which is about the consumer welfare standard. We can't complete a conversation without discussing it, obviously. And I think, from my perspective, the critiques of the consumer welfare standard as woefully inadequate are impeccable. It seems obvious to me, whether you're talking about in the antitrust case or just more broadly in economics, that the idea that all we are here to do is optimize consumer welfare is a very unwise way to proceed with policy. The challenge, of course, is that in many contexts, it is then easy for me to say, well, it's a political question. It is up to our political system and the competing constituencies to decide what is going to be prioritized how. When you're talking about enforcement actions, you can't say it's a political question. You sort of have to have standards. So I'm curious how how you define those at this point. What would you say is whether it's a balancing test, a hierarchy? What is the way that consumer welfare should be traded off against some of these other concerns in deciding how to address competition issues?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up a lot, and I think sometimes can kind of be overwrought as a question in terms of its like salience for enforcers. Sometimes it's used, this question is used as a shorthand for, well, do you care about consumers or do you not care about consumers? And I don't know any antitrust enforcer or even kind of competition policy thinker that thinks antitrust doesn't protect consumers. I think the questions have been, A, does the law actually say that the only beneficiaries of the antitrust laws are consumers? And no, the law doesn't say that, right? The word consumer doesn't even appear in any of the foundational antitrust texts. And then I think the second issue has been the fact that there is this empirical research showing that a consumer welfare centric approach to antitrust has actually has actually failed to serve consumers. And so if your consumer welfare approach to antitrust is failing on its own terms, I think that really requires a re-examination of what we're doing, what are the tools that we're using, what are the methods that we're trying to use to figure out what's going to happen in the future. I think as a matter of law, there is very clear Supreme Court precedent that says it is not up to antitrust enforcers to trade off benefits to some market participants against harms to other market participants. So if a merger, for example, would reduce competition in product markets in ways that hurt consumers, it's not appropriate for us to say, okay, but there are going to be some benefits for workers on the labor competition side, and so we're going to decide that's a trade-off worth doing. The inverse is also true. If a deal would reduce competition in labor markets, but the companies are saying, well, yeah, we'll be able to squeeze wages, but don't worry, we'll pass on those savings to consumers. That's also a policy trade-off that is not our job to engage in. And so, we have to look market by market and figure out, is there a law violation? There may be kind of prosecutorial discretion reasons for agencies to focus in some places rather than other places. But those types of welfare trade-offs are ones that are really more appropriate for lawmakers and other policymakers rather than law enforcers for, the very reason that you noted.
Yeah, no, that's a helpful corrective that in a sense, the consumer welfare standard is the strange departure from what the enforcement principle is actually supposed to be, which is a much more descriptive concern about market power and anti-competitive practice. Somewhere along the way, people came along and said, well, we don't want to be worried too much about those things, so let's only take them seriously if somebody can make a consumer welfare case. And it seems like what you're saying is the consumer welfare case is interesting and relevant, but at the end of the day, the inquiry is in a sense the easier one about the actual concentration and anti-competitive behavior.
That's right.
All right. Well, Chair Khan, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for making the time. Thank you for all of the work that you've been doing and the ideas that you have been bringing to these debates, which I think have been incredibly important to moving them forward. And we wish you the best with the remainder of your tenure.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks to you and your team for also continuing to really host interesting discussions. I think there are deep bipartisan interest in some of these issues, and I think it's really great that there are spaces like yours to be able to showcase that.
Oh, thank you, and we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.